So yeah, as I said, my name is Dhruv. I work mostly on the back end at Khan Academy. And about 9 months ago, Khan Academy started using GraphQL in production. And really, we found it easy to adopt. We have a large existing internal API, and we have lots of developers who depend on it. But we found it easy to take parts of that and start rolling it out across the organization. But one thing we've run into issues in over the last year is how to handle errors. So errors are inevitable in any sort of API. You have a database that fails, or a user might send some sort of invalid input, or maybe you make a mistake and deploy something bad to production. And we've made some mistakes in how we handle errors in GraphQL over the last year, and so I want to talk about some of those mistakes and the lessons we've learned as a result. So to dive right in, one thing we learned is that some errors really aren't errors at all. And we can start with a simple example here. Can imagine a sign-up form that we have on our site. We want to allow the user to sign up. If they fail validation, we want to say, hey, this email address is taken. You one. So how might we do this in GraphQL? I'm going to start with the simplest possible approach. This is where we started. And then I'm going to go back and tell you why it's not quite ideal. So we could define a simple mutation, create a user, and if we're successful, give me back the user's ID and their email. And on the server side, the code would be also pretty simple. We check to see if the user exists, and if they do, we throw a JavaScript error, we stop execution, and then we move on. If they don't exist, we send it back, we create the user, no big deal. So if we're unsuccessful with that code, the response might be what you see on the left there, right? We see that we are unsuccessful with that null value and create user. And then we can go look at the errors list and say, hey, there's an email exist errors. I should highlight the field in our form. And you've probably seen this errors list before. This is something that the GraphQL spec defines as like where you put during execution. So since we threw an error in our mutation and it ends up here, and that's simple, it works. What happens if we then want to add another validation step? We want to check to see if your password's too weak. So we could add another thing to this errors list. Maybe we throw 2 errors, but then it's kind of hard for us to know which of these 2 errors go with which field. Maybe we can start adding more data to our errors. We could say, like, you need to include a field for every error so that we know where to show it in the UI. This starts to feel, again, pretty brittle. What if down the road we want a different mutation or a different component that has errors for a field, or doesn't want to specify a field but wants to specify multiple fields? It also starts to feel like we're standardizing on the format of an error. We're standardizing on a schema here. And that feels not quite right. Let's go back and look at that original query. So here we're explicitly trying to create a user. We're also explicitly asking for the ID and email of that user. The way that our code is written now, we're also we're implicitly depending on errors and implicitly expecting the schema to be consistent. So that doesn't really feel like the GraphQL approach, which really goes for an explicit way of defining our data. And why not do that for errors here as well? So we can treat this sort of error as another type of data. We can try to create a user, and if we're unsuccessful, instead of throwing an error, we just get that success or failure back as a Boolean. And then in this case, get a list of user errors which have a field and a message. But that doesn't have to be true down the road. If we change our format, we know what components depend on this type of error. And another mutation can have a different contract with a different component. So we maintain flexibility for the future. So that was our first lesson, which was just don't treat validation errors. And I think Tony talked about this in his talk. As errors, you should treat them as data and build them into your schema and spec that clients that depend on them. Sorry for the mic. Okay, so that was a subtle mistake. I'm going to talk about 2 smaller ones in the time that I have left. They're not as important, or at least, sorry, they're not as in depth, but I think they're important to keep in mind. So the second mistake we made was just not monitoring our errors correctly. So here is a screenshot of Khan Academy's error dashboard. I'm sure many of you have something similar at your jobs. We keep track of the number of requests that end up here as a 500 error. And 500 usually tells us as backend developers that something went wrong and I need to go investigate. And if I see a spike like this, I need to really investigate. So when we started deploying GraphQL, we found this approach didn't work the way that we expected it to. And we missed issues that we should have detected with this sort of monitoring. So let's go back to this code I showed earlier. I told you again, it's not ideal to do it this way, but let's say we deploy this code. We probably want to keep track of the number of errors that happen, the number of times that this email exists error gets thrown. So how can we know that an error happened so that we can track it? On the client side, we see the error in the list. Like we know that an error happened because there's something in that error's key. But what's confusing is if you look at the status code that you get back, it makes it seem like everything is okay. You know, Chrome has this really nice green dot. It says like, hey, don't worry, we got this. And so our existing tools for monitoring just ignored this as an issue. We weren't getting notified that something was happening in our production servers. So the lesson here is simple, really just don't do that. Make sure you're tracking your errors. And for us, that was also really simple. Like when we execute our GraphQL query, we can just log if there were errors. And that's not the only way to solve this problem. Eric just talked about the spec doesn't define anything about the transport layer and whether you need to say 200 or 500. So if you wanted to, you could just respond with 500, and maybe that works for your use case. We chose to do it this way and leave it as 200, log it separately, because that let us do things like support multiple GraphQL queries in the same HTTP request. It also lets us do things like partial query success and not necessarily mess up our clients that do something when they get a 500 message. Awesome. So the last mistake I want to talk about today is just we didn't provide enough information to our developers when we started with GraphQL. Errors are really good debugging tools. You know, as a new developer working on a new API, errors help you figure out what went wrong so that you can make it, you can take action. In our internal API, if I made a mistake and I deployed some code, this is the sort of message I would get back. It has a stack trace. It tells me exactly where a problem happened. And I can go investigate that pretty quickly. When we rolled out GraphQL, this was what you would get as a client developer. You would just get a string of the error. Maybe that would tell you enough to figure out what went wrong, but you didn't have a stack trace. You didn't necessarily even know what part of your query caused the problem. And this caused a lot of pain for our developers as they started ramping up in GraphQL. Again, the lesson here is pretty simple. Just try to provide as much information as possible into your error to make it actionable. So this is easy to fix. You just try to include things like a stack trace or a request ID or a trace. And I think something that Tony said earlier too resonated, which was just don't depend on this being a schema that you can rely on, right? Treat this as debugging information so that it's helpful to you, but you don't necessarily have to rely on it being there forever, and clients don't necessarily rely on it being consistent. These sorts of errors should be exceptional, and they should help you in debugging, not necessarily on a day-to-day basis. Great. Just to wrap up real quick, some errors really are data. You should treat them that way, especially validation errors. Make sure that you're not making the same mistake that we are, and track your errors when you deploy to production. And then make sure that you make errors actionable so that developers know how to take action. So thanks so much. I hope you find this useful and you learn from our mistakes. If you want to chat about this, find me later.